I'm Aisha. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
Hello everyone, I'm Charna Davis-Wiese and welcome to UCF Expressions. One of the most fun things I get to do on the show is interview people who write books. And this man can come back about 100 times because he's written about 100 books and articles. Join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Ford. And we're going to talk about your latest. And it amazes me because you were just here not too long ago and you've written this whole other book. Do you sleep?
I try.
Now, this book is about something that I didn't even know existed. Now, we live in Orlando, so we know that there are conventions that come here, and there are people that come here, and a lot of our economy is run on that. But I never really stopped to think that there are actually people whose job it is to make that happen and make that happen in a good way. Never knew it.
There are, and it's a pretty big profession, too. There's a lot of folks who do this for a living and all across the world, not only in the United States, where we like to get together and meet a lot, but also in Europe and Asia and all across everywhere in the world. Africa is using this as a developmental tool to try to get more people to come and visit, to bring economic prosperity and economic development to the people who live there. In fact, that's really how this industry got started, is about the turn of the last century. There was a lot of economic problems in a number of cities, and they were looking for ways to get people interested in coming to their city to spend money, because the retailers weren't doing well, the hotels weren't full, and so forth. And you had the development of the railroads right about that same time, with a wonderful transportation network so people could get from here to there pretty easily. And Americans like to meet. We're really big on associations and getting together and talking to one another, which is unusual actually for our culture as opposed to other cultures that are out there. And so we had this growth in this meeting market where people would go to a city and they'd bring all their friends or people who were in the same industry, or a manufacturer would bring in people who were their sales reps to talk about new products and things that they ought to be aware of. And so they have these meetings. Well, somebody had to put them together and somebody had to recruit them, and it turned into a fairly big business pretty fast. About 1888 or so, Milwaukee became the first city I could find that set up a convention and visitor bureau. And so you can get the time frame of this. In about 1915 or so, they created an association, a professional association of people. They called them the Association of Convention Secretaries, and they met in St. Louis to talk about how they could become professionals, because they were a pretty rowdy group up until this point in time. They would go out and try to convince people to come to their city and spend lots of money, and they would perhaps tell a few falsehoods and maybe stretch the truth here and there. So those people who were offended by that and maybe aggrieved by that thought it would be a good idea to create an ethical position. So they got together a group of people who swore that they would uphold ethical practices and teach people how to run conventions, because it's not easy to run a convention if you've never done one, and also to see if they could teach scientific management principles, which was kind of the big buzzword at the turn of the 19th century. So it was kind of an interesting process, and everybody wanted money. And the idea would be, if you bring people into your community, they would not only spend money, but they might even come and stay and bring their businesses. And one of the early articles that I had fun reading and writing about was in 1915. They talked about how Packard went to Detroit and was so impressed with the fairness of Detroit and what a pretty city it was and how friendly all the folks were that he came and brought his automobile plant and set it up in Detroit. And they claim in the article in 1915 writing about this, that of course that was responsible for the creation of Detroit becoming an automobile manufacturing center. And anybody who loves their city or their community wants to bring people in to visit. And the hope was, particularly after the Depression in 1890s, that maybe they bring a company in with them.
Well, it makes perfect sense now that I think about it. You think of these, I'm sure it wasn't as massive as it is now. Conventions can be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and
Right.
it has to be organized. It has to be someone to put it together. I almost feel silly never even thinking about that.
It's a huge business in the United States and of course across the world, and it originally got its impetus from the economic development idea, but it grew a lot after World War II when more and more transportation, people had cars, they could easily get from one place to another, and of course in the interstate highway system allowed people to move around, and like I said earlier, we as Americans really like to get together and talk to each other in some organized pattern, and somebody has to figure out how to put those pieces together to make sure the restaurants have capacity and the hotels have rooms available, and somebody has a space where
They
they
could all get there and there's nowhere to stay.
Right, that would be a problem.
Or they're all in different places.
Right.
So the Convention Visitor Bureau,
Right.
and are they run by the local governments? Is it a separate business? How does that work?
Well, there are a lot of different models out there. The most popular model, if I can use that term in the United States, is the Membership Bureau, which is what we have here in Orlando. And as you may have pointed out earlier, that Bill Pieper is the co-author of this book, and Bill was the fellow that got me interested in Convention and Visitor Bureau executives, because he is the former CEO of the Orlando Orange County Convention and Visitor Bureau. Quite a mouthful, a lot of words there. But I had approached him in 2003 if he would be interested in writing a book, because earlier on he had told me one time when he was
10 years earlier.
10 years earlier, actually, when we were in Universal Studios together at a bar, he said, wouldn't it be nice if somebody would write a book about what we do, because nobody really understands what we do for a living. And I said, that's an interesting idea. And 10 years later, it kind of gestated up to...
you were probably busy writing 100 books.
Well,
in that
whatever.
time.
We were doing other things. But anyway, I called Bill and I said, are you ready to write that book? And after he gulped kind of hard and thought, well, why not? Let's do it. So we sat down, and I've been working on it, started in January 2004, actually, and it is now out. We actually got it in print in January of this year, 2008. So it's been a 4-year project to get it from agreement to do it to actually getting it in print. It's been fun, though.
Managing Destination Marketing Organizations. Now, what this actually is a compilation of people who have been successful in doing this.
That's right.
For other people. Now, are there ever conventions of convention planners? I mean,
Yes.
are there a lot of them, or is there one per city, or how does that work?
Well, the convention planners are usually people who are bringing a convention to a city.
Mm-hmm.
Convention bureaus are people who do the sales and marketing to get them to come to a city.
Okay, gotcha.
And so these folks here that we were writing about, it's a pretty interesting job if you think about it, because most of these folks, particularly the membership bureaus like what we have here in Orlando, you have two bosses, and they're different, and they have different goals. And so Bill would have, for example, the hotel and the attractions and the restaurants and everybody who was dependent upon the tourism industry for their livelihood as part of his members. They would guide him, they would advise him, they would review his mission, and they would review his performance as a leader of the OOCVB. On the other side of the coin, they were funded by the bed tax, largely by the bed tax, although they had other revenues as well, but the bed tax is the bulk of where their money comes from, and that's a governmental tax. So the government is on the other side saying this is the money you have to work with, and your bosses are on the other side saying, well, this is what you need to do. So Bill stands between these two groups of people who have different goals, different objectives, different time horizons, and different constituencies they're reporting to and are accountable to. And
It's amazing to think of how long he did that too.
I kid him a lot that it must have been a real challenge to keep his sanity under some of those conditions, but You know, I think all of these folks that do this well, and what we did in the book is we went out and interviewed about 22 executives, and we found 9 successful and 9 unsuccessful, which we won't go into how we found the 9 unsuccessful and why they would talk to us, but we found these two groups of people and compared how they did things to see if there's any difference between the behaviors, the activities, and the
Is there a success model, and is there a failure
Yes.
model?
And there is. There was clearly a difference between the successful executives and the unsuccessful executives in fairly specific ways. And probably the most specific way that I can think of to summarize what the real difference is most of these folks come up through sales. So they've been in sales and marketing, and most of these people, like you and I, like to hang around with people who are like them. And so when you grow up through an organization and you're in sales, you like to talk to other salespeople or to talk to customers, because that's really what got you to the dance, so to speak. On the other side of the coin, the successful managers, CVB executives, were those who were able to say, you know, as much as I like to talk to people and market and sell, the people I really need to talk to are all of my stakeholders to make sure that they're all interested, aware of, and involved and supportive of what it is we do. And it's kind of like the old song, you know, if you can't be with the one you love, you better love the ones you're with. And with the political considerations and the governmental oversight of the revenue source for many of these bureaus, it was important that these folks spend time with the governmental people. And the ones we found were most successful were the ones that were happy to do that, enjoyed doing it, and were successful at it. The ones that were not successful, CVB executives, tended to be those who hated it. And they wouldn't tell politicians anyway, they wouldn't talk to the media, and they just were not, they wanted to go sell.
And that didn't work.
No, it didn't work.
Because it's actually it's the ultimate job of politics as well.
It is. And the successful ones understood that, recognized it, and did it. It was really fun to talk to them. They were very interesting people.
So what would be the difference between a community with a successful CVB and an unsuccessful one? Do the conventions actually not come, or
Yes.
is that how you gauged it, by the amount of convention business that came?
Well, it'd be part of the success factor. The other part of the success factor is if you think about the revenues generated by the tourism dollars, it's governmentally driven, so it's oversight. And we've seen this in Orlando, where people look at this pot of money and think, you know, are there other things we should be doing with it other than marketing our destination to bring in all these travelers and these conventioneers and these tourists? And gee, wouldn't it be nice if we built a new road, or wouldn't it be nice if we paid some police officers, or wouldn't it be nice if we hired some teachers or did whatever? And so, or wouldn't it be nice if we set up an arts center or supported other things besides the marketing of the destination? And so there's always that tension between what we're set up to do as a marketing and sales operation and what it would be nice to do with all that money. And most of the cities that we talked to that were successful tended to be able to convince the political leadership that it was important to continue marketing the destination for the welfare of the entire community, that everybody depended upon the value added of tourists coming into the community, and therefore it's in their interest to continue that. The less successful ones tended not to be able to make that argument very well, and politicians being politicians could see a revenue source that would help them provide some things for their voters without costing their voters any additional money, and tended to divert those resources.
So they had to politic the politicians. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we come back. Don't go away. Welcome back to UCF Expressions. I'm Charna Davis-Wiese, and we're talking with Dr. Robert Ford about one of his latest books, Managing Destination Marketing Organizations. Basically, what it's like to be the head of a convention and visitors bureau, because they don't just happen, it takes a lot of work. Now, you interviewed 9 successful, 9 unsuccessful in this country, but then you went outside of the country. And you say one person really inspired you.
Yes, I went to South Africa as part of the interviews because we were asked by the organization that sponsored me in doing this, and they didn't sponsor us financially, but they sponsored us by opening doors, which is just as important when you're trying to do a research project like this. And so we went to outside the United States to several places, and I'll tell you two quick stories which I found fascinating. The first was in South Africa, and we interviewed the lady that was the head of the Cape Town, South Africa Convention and Visitor Bureau, and the passion that this woman displayed in talking about how she felt it was important to use tourism as a vehicle to help her people become part of the economic mainstream was just really an inspiring story. This woman was so amazingly committed to what she was doing, and she saw tourism, as many people do around the world, as a path to bring people out of poverty, out of lack of education, because you can't greet a tourist unless you can speak to them, and you can't handle money unless you can do basic math, and you can't be in a tourist area unless you have basic hygiene issues resolved. So there's a lot of really wonderful educational vehicles that tourism provides to people who are trying to get a foot on the economic ladder and be part of it. So it's a terrific industry for people who are trying to bring their people out of the lack of education, lack of economic opportunity, and lack of personal development into the mainstream of the world. And that's good for all of us, you know. So listening to her passion was absolutely wonderful and inspiring opportunity for me.
And that's probably part of the juggling that you were talking about.
Yes.
Some local politicians who may say, well, I can put this money here rather than give it to the CVB. However, the money given to bringing conventions and bring jobs and bring, in the long run,
Sure,
it may do better for the community. How about Vancouver?
Well, we also talked to a gentleman in Vancouver who was just a stellar manager, and the story that he had to tell was really fascinating because he was talking about after 9/11, and when 9/11 hit, the entire airspace in the United States was closed, and all of the boats that were at sea and anybody who was outside the United States couldn't get there. And so his story was talking about how his people had to exercise an enormous amount of effort to house people that had to land somewhere. And so they would land in Vancouver, and they would dock in Vancouver, and they had this surge of people that had to come back somewhere into the mainland because they were not.
You can't just fly
you
around.
can't fly around forever.
And land.
And so they were trying to find housing for all these people. They were trying to find food for all these people, and not everybody had the wherewithal to, stay at top level hotels or to pay for a lot of expenses because they were on vacation or they were on their way back home and they were a little bit strapped. So the question is, how do you help these folks get through this kind of a period of time when they can't get back home because the airspace is closed and they can't dock a ship and so forth. And he said it was really an eerie experience for him because he spends most of his life trying to entertain and relate to people who are at Vancouver because they want to be there. And here he had this period of time where he had to entertain and relate to people who were in Vancouver who didn't want to be there.
And who were frightened.
And who were frightened and wished they were back home instead of being where they were in Canada. And so it was a very interesting story. I mean, you don't think about how somebody deals with these kinds of problems, but all these different events that happen in the world we read about in the newspapers have these unintended consequences that leave dribs and drabs that somebody has to pick up and deal with. And that was a great story, I thought, about somebody who had to figure out a way, and all of his people pitched in. They housed people in their own homes and cook them meals and do all this kind of stuff that they could to facilitate helping these people get through this crisis period in their lives as well as in their nation's lives.
I would imagine that they may come into play in other disasters, other problems. For example, when people leave Florida in droves because a hurricane's coming, do the CVBs ever come into play then where there may be a mass of people coming into, I don't know, Texas, and then they'll leave in a day or two or turn right around?
Sure. If you think about New Orleans and Katrina, I mean, New Orleans was devastated, and their whole industry. Well, you have all these people who are supposed to arrive in New Orleans on the day after Katrina for a convention, because they have a very robust convention business, or did, and all these hotels had bookings, and all these air flights were scheduled to come in, and all these people had their plans made, and all these activities were going to take place, and all of a sudden they're gone. And so the question is, now what do you do? And who picks up those pieces and tries to find a path by which all these folks can be either accommodated somewhere else, or the programs can be taken care of somewhere else, or what, and that's part of what they did. And if you remember, when all those folks went over to Houston, they stayed, I believe, in the convention center over in Houston as temporary housing until they could find ways of dispersing them to other kinds of residential accommodation.
And now they have a whole other job, and to bring people back.
Yeah. And if you, again, to use New Orleans as an example, if you watch what's going on there now, they're working very, very hard to try to get people to feel good about coming back to New Orleans and having conventions back there, because so much of their economy was driven by the tourism sector. I mean, if you think about the French Quarter, I'm sure you've been to the French Quarter and you've stayed in that area, you know that that's all tourist driven. And all of a sudden, if you have no tourists, you have nobody to support your school system, you have nobody to support the livelihoods of people who worked in the industry and so forth. So the ripple effect of not having those people come had some major ramifications for New Orleans that we're still seeing today. If you talk to their politicians or hear about what they're saying in their public pronouncements, they really want people to come back. The other side of that, the other interesting piece of that, is that the people who worked in the industry also left. If they lost their job and they don't have a lot of money in the bank and they don't have a place to live, then they need to go somewhere else. And so they were having a challenge in that industry as well, bringing back the people who would service the tourists if they could bring back the tourists to be serviced. So it's a big kind of cycle, if you will, of economic interdependencies that really is quite fascinating when you start looking at it and realize the power of those dollars to generate jobs and to make other good things happen in a community.
And especially facing a possible downturn in the economy.
Yes.
More than possible, probable. I imagine the CVBs have to go into full-scale mode to try to make sure that people are still coming.
Sure.
And that they might have a rough road ahead of them.
Well, if you look at Orlando, we're very dependent, for example, on gas. And so as the price of gas goes up, we have to come up with ideas and programs that would encourage people to come here in spite of the cost of gas. And we've seen in some destinations where they will send people chits or vouchers to pay for the gas to get them from wherever they are into their destination. And you can just envision that, all this disaster planning does take place. These folks have to think through whatever could happen to us, how can we make sure that it doesn't so badly hurt us that it's going to cost us jobs and economic opportunity and the fallout that's associated with that.
And one of the trends is geotourism.
Yeah.
People maybe extend that to their conventions. They're coming in groups as we want to go someplace that's going to be green.
Right.
It's going to be green for us to do this.
Yes, it's a big topic these days, ecotourism, and to try to provide opportunities to not only do things that support the environment and give back to the environment. You see a lot of conventions will come in and they'll do Habitat for Humanity, for example. The attendees will go out and build a house, or they'll go out and recycle the stuff that they're bringing into the convention instead of throwing it away. And so there's a lot of real interest in this industry in the green movement, and I think it's noteworthy for them and really commendable of them to be kind of out in front of a lot of other industries and trying to say, you know what, we need to reduce our carbon footprint. How do we do it?
Now you're surprised that this is being used as a textbook. It wasn't written to be a textbook.
Well, we originally wrote it in response to Bill saying, we need to find out from each other what we do, and our hope originally was to make this kind of a coffee table book for every CVB executive in the United States who wants to check on what he's doing or what she's doing to be better at their job.
Or what not to do to be a
Right,
failure.
Right. And we thought that would be, our original goal was to be helpful to the practitioner. But we're finding also that academics are very interested. We've had it reviewed now by a couple of academic journals, and it's actually been used in a couple of courses so far where the students seem to like it. It's full of quotes. We extensively use quotations in here because we wanted the voice of the interviewee to drive the flavor of the book. And there's a lot of quotes in there so you can really get a sense of what kind of jobs these folks are doing, what they're worried about and what they're happy about, and what makes them feel like they've done a good job and what makes them feel like they have done not such a great job. And so we debated at great length whether we wanted to use that much quoted material, and finally decided why not let these folks speak for themselves, and the students seem to like it because it's like having a conversation with a person who's actually doing the job, and that's a good feeling from our standpoint.
Did you plan for them to be anonymous, or
Yes.
did they want to be? You did plan, even the successor ones, they
Yes.
were freer to talk?
Well, it puts you in an awkward position if you identify the successful and don't identify the unsuccessful, because then everybody's at a meeting going,
Let's
were
see
you
who's
one of
left
them?
out.
Yeah, who's not here? And so we decided as the wisest course of action was to make everyone anonymous, and the only persons we have identified so far have been the non-U.S. Group that hasn't fallen into either category. They're just non-U.S. to add some international dimension to what it is we were discovering.
So tell me about your next project.
My next project, we are in the process now actually of getting put into print another book on the Fun Minute Manager is what it's tentatively titled.
This is one of your big things, making work fun.
It is. I think work should be enjoyable, and what a concept, huh? And most people think it should be enjoyable, and a lot of people think it isn't. So one of the things we thought would be fun to do is to write a kind of a blueprint as to how a manager who felt the way we feel, which is it ought to be fun to come to work and enjoy your job, to give that person a blueprint as to how to actually make the job fun, and some rationale and some measures and so forth, so that that individual could trace through whether or not he or she was making the job fun for the people who work for him.
Did you actually go and look at places that are considered fun?
Yes, there's a lot of anecdotal material out there of organizations that are, quote, fun places to work.
Pixar's famous for it.
Yeah, you know, they just do different kinds of things, and different companies do different kinds of things to create a sense of fun. This book grew out of a research project we did with the Society for Human Resource Management, and we went and surveyed a whole bunch of HR people and asked them what made their workplace fun and what did they do and were they having fun and so forth. And what we learned out of that, we basically spun into this book as a guideline for people who wanted to make their own particular organization a fun place to work.
So you come back when I can hold that and we'll talk about
If you invite me, I'll
making
come.
this place more fun. This place is fun. Have
It
you
is.
noticed how much fun we're having?
It is. I am.
Dr. Robert Ford, thank you so much. Managing Destination Marketing Organizations, How to Plan a Convention. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on UCF Expressions.